Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rafael Mangual. I'm a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute and a contributing editor of City Journal. I want to thank you all for tuning into this Manhattan Institute eventcast. Before I get started, I'd like to invite all of you to submit any questions that you have for our featured guests directly into the chat or comment boxes of whichever platforms you're watching us on, and I will do my best to get to as many as I can during the last leg of our event. And so with that, a few minutes behind schedule, and I apologize for that, let's begin. And I want to start by going back 30 years when New York City was in the middle of its bloodiest year ever, one that would end with 2,262 murders. Now that year, 1990, also ended with robberies, burglaries, and grand larcenies, all breaking six figures. Now our guest today, Commissioner Dermot Shea, joined the NYPD just a few months later in April of 1991, when he was assigned to the 4-6 precinct in the Bronx. Now, in 1990, the 4-6 saw 82 murders, which for context is just two fewer than the 84 that occurred in the entire borough of the Bronx last year. Now, what followed was a prodigious climb through the department's ranks, an impressive career whose upward trajectory was matched only by the impressive downward trajectory of the city's violent crime through 2019, which is when he was named the 44th commissioner of the New York City Police Department. Now, I'm a betting man, and so I'd confidently wager that those two trend lines are not unrelated, which is why I'm so grateful that he agreed to share his perspective on such important issues with us all today. So I hope all of you at home will give us a warm virtual welcome to our guest of honor, Commissioner Shea. Thank you so much for being here.
Rafael, thank you. Thank you for having me. The honor is mine. I look forward to a spirited conversation today about something that I'm quite proud of, and the work of the men and women of this department and New York City overall. So I look forward to it.
Well, fantastic. Let's jump right in. So I led into your introduction by highlighting some of the crime numbers from the early 1990s, in part because I think a lot of people have either forgotten what it was like back then, or they just weren't around to see, what the bad old days were like. And so I was hoping that you can start us off by kind of just telling us a little bit about what the Bronx and the city more broadly was like when you first got onto the job, and what are some of the kind of more notable similarities and differences that you think cops on the beat are dealing with today?
Yeah, so I came on in April of 1991, and as you said, I got out of the police academy at the end of, I think it was October of 1991, and was stationed to the hybrids section of the Bronx. So if you're familiar with the Bronx, it's a little bit north of Yankee Stadium there. And it was an area, 1 square mile. I think there was 90 murders in 1991 in that square mile. Yeah, it's unbelievable when you think about it in today's terms. And there really is, Rafael, there's really no comparison in terms of what the street looked like. It was just complete poverty. Burned out buildings was still quite frequent. Garbage piled up on the streets. It was a time when there was so much crime that I think there was as much crime as there was probably just as much not reported, because there was a feeling that reporting it didn't do anything. So gunshots were common, burned out cars were common, and that's a tough place when I think back now. It's the same as then. You would go to some jobs and you would just shake your head and say, what a terrible situation that when you'd see good, hardworking people and trying to raise a family in that environment and all the obstacles that they had. So when you look fast forward 20, 30 years later on what the city has turned into and the growth, and still obviously we have pockets of problems and we still have poverty and a lot of issues, societal issues, but New York City has really just been turned around. And we have our obstacles this year for sure. Hopefully, I'm not a bad luck charm, but it's been a tough year, but New Yorkers are resilient. We have a great police department, and we're going to get out of this. It's just a matter of, I think taking care of some small things. Things are always a little dark, but we need some fixes. We need, to start getting the ship moving in the right direction, but we'll get there.
Well, as you mentioned, we've really come an incredibly long way since the bad old days of the 1990s. I grew up in Brooklyn, in a neighborhood that's now quite gorgeous. It wasn't so much, when I was a young kid. when we think about just how night and day the city's sort of 30-year trajectory has become, what would you say are the, maybe the 2 or 3 kind of most important tools or tactics that were utilized by not just the NYPD, but by the criminal justice system more broadly, that help kind of bring that change about and make life livable in so many more parts of the city for so many hardworking families?
Yeah, well, on the policing side, I think I have a unique perspective because for a number of years going back, I ran the CompStat, so I saw both sides. I used to, as a young lieutenant, I attended CompStats, and it wasn't a fun place to be back in the, that was 1998, I think, was the first time I attended a CompStat. CompStat came in roughly 1994, 95. I attended first time in 98, and then years later, to be trusted by Bill Bratton and put in charge of running the CompStat, I kind of came full circle. There's no comparison. I think that when I look back and you look at back when crime was so rampant in the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s, because I grew up in Queens, there was a lot of low-hanging fruit in those early years. And I think the biggest change was the mindset of, yes, we can do something about this. And I think that the police department led the way in many ways in taking an attitude of, it doesn't have to be this way. We can do better. And over years then of taking affirmative steps and dealing with some of the smaller issues in crime and smaller issues then became parts of larger overall strategies that were put into place. And over the years, really transformed the streets. That's number one. It was the little things. It was the mindset. It was the feeling that the police can make a difference. And you started to see then other partners in law enforcement. You started to see prosecutors. I mean, we didn't do it alone by any stretch of the imagination. But in those early years, there was a lot of low-hanging fruit. I think fast forward 20, 25 years later, when I started to run CompStat, it was a different time. So we needed different strategies, and we started to use technology more. And it was coming out of a period of different societal beliefs about mass incarceration. And we had to get a different mindset. And I think that when you stand here today and look back, that's one of the frustrating things from my view, that we have evolved over time as a police department in terms of changing. Sometimes we've made mistakes, but we've also recognized those mistakes. We consider ourselves a reforming agency, and we're having a great debate take place right now across the United States about law enforcement and policing in general. And many people are coming up to us and saying, well, you need to do things differently. You need to reform, and here's some things that you need to put into place. And when we look at that list of reforms that we have to do, we come back and say, well, we actually did that already. So I think policing is a bit of an evolution. It's not something that you put a plan into place and carry out the plan. It's something that you have to be constantly evaluating, because what works today may not work tomorrow. In fact, I can guarantee it probably won't. Laws are changing, societal attitudes are changing, the environment around us is changing, and we have to be just as nimble. So I think you're seeing some of that right now. Different laws being passed, tools maybe being taken away, but you're not going to put your hands up in the air and say we can't do it anymore. Just this morning at this desk, I chaired a meeting with some great minds in the police department on, okay, what are we doing? What are we going to do to drive the violence back down? We know we have a pretty significant spike of gang violence in parts of the city.
Right.
We will adapt and we'll continue to push it down.
Yeah, I mean, getting into that uptake, I mean, it's no secret this is on the minds of everyone. I'm sure that it's a major concern of our audience here watching live. I mean, through August 16th, murders in the city are up 30%, shootings are up 82%, and this past June was apparently the worst on record since 1996 for that month. Now, even if you look at the 2-year increases, they seem to be right around the same. And so as you mentioned, a lot of that violence is concentrated in relatively small parts of the city, and probably, being committed by a relatively small cohort of bad actors. But I have a couple questions here. One is it fair to say that what we're seeing now is more than just a blip? And if it is, what are kind of the driving forces of that? You said, you mentioned chairing a meeting, developing strategies about that. But before you get to strategy, I think you have to identify the source of a problem. And does the department have a sense of what that might be?
Yeah, and it's boy, this is complicated would be an understatement, Rafael. I think context is important here too. You brought out some of those numbers. In the early 90s, we had 2,200 murders. We had 5,000 shootings a year. At the peak, Rikers Island back then, I think the peak was about 21,000 prisoners in Rikers Island. So a lot of crime, in response to that, a lot of policies and incarceration. They drove down the crime, certainly. And then you fast forward decades, literally. And I took over, I came into this building in 2011 or 12. And we were looking at shootings in the range of 12 to 1,300 roughly a year, I think. One of the things I'm probably most proud of is how we developed strategies in this new day and age to really use data to identify who's doing the most crimes. Taking CompStat to probably a new level with technology and data, and putting systems in place and breaking down silos internally and sharing information to really identify patterns as quickly as possible. Also to recognize that arrests are meaningless without meaningful prosecutions and ultimate outcomes. Because we don't want to make 10 arrests of the same individual. We want one arrest, and we want that arrest to stick, and we want that person to be, if it's appropriate, incarcerated. So convictions and working with prosecutors better. And over those 4 or 5 years, we got to a place where we drove down incarceration, which is lost. We drove it down significantly in New York City. We drove shootings down from over 1,000 to under 1,000 to under 900 to under 800. We drove homicides down under 300. Right. We drove index crimes down under 100,000. And these are numbers, but they're really people. We got the precision piece so good over the last 4 or 5 years here, where we drove the incarceration in Rikers Island last year down to about 7,000 people from a peak of 21. So that's the good news. Ultimately, really precise in getting New York safer and having less people in jail. So that's the lead into this year. The first major thing I would put and there's a lot of different things that took place. Challenges, you have to adapt to challenges in the laws, but probably the biggest one that took place last year was the bail reform law in New York State. And, Lord, there's been so much said about this, and people dig their heels in on each side. But I think if people are fair, number one, when I talk about bail reform, I always make the point, we were for reforming bail reform because we don't think it's appropriate for somebody to be in jail because they don't have money and somebody else gets out of jail and they don't have money for the same offense. That's not right. The way that it was meant to go, and there was a lot of different pieces in the bail reform legislation that people don't even understand. So, it changed discovery rules. It changed the rules for what penal law charges can you even ask for bail. And if you can ask for it, you have to ask for the least restrictive manner. So everything was done and designed in a manner that would lower the incarceration rates. That's ultimately how the law was crafted, and it was very effective. It also did things that people don't realize that we're dealing with today, where it instead of having the police department having policies on who can be issued desk appearance tickets for minor crimes. And we make those decisions and say, well, we'll give a desk appearance ticket for a low-level theft. But if you do that same crime over and over many times, we may make a decision that you're not going to get a desk appearance ticket anymore. You may have to go see a judge. That was taken out of our hands, and that was legislated. And we're dealing with the repercussions of that. And some would argue that's exactly what we meant to do, and it's a good thing. Incarceration came down. I think my main response to that would be we need balance. And what happened was when that law was signed and judges and prosecutors started to react to what was coming January 1st, you saw a pretty significant, I think it's been a while since I talked about this, but I think it was about a 20% drop in the prison population jails in New York City, Rikers Island, in 1 month. So from November 30th to January 1st, 20% of the jail got put onto the street. And again, I would argue context. When there was 21,000 people in Rikers Island, there was a lot of people that was swept up. When we had reduced it to 7,000, we were getting more and more to a core group of people that were responsible for the most crime in New York City. And when you let 20% of those out in 1 month, I would ask the people that advocated for that, what was put into place to ensure that they would not be reoffending? What social programs? I hear the term supervised release. Lord, I'm tired of hearing it because I think it's a buzzword at this point. What was really done to provide supervision and alternatives to those individuals that would give them the best possible chance to live a different life?
So what I hear you saying really is that, the department's position is not one that is opposed to reform, rather that you can actually continue to police well and effectively by being more precise in how you deploy resources and get more bang for your buck. However, it is necessary that the other parts of the system are kind of working with the department to ensure that the few folks on whom the department is concentrating are actually seeing consequences. And we started off the discussion by talking about some of the differences and similarities. One thing that I do see, as just a more casual observer of this sort of issue, is that it seems to me that what we're seeing a lot more of is these repeat offenders who are getting arrested for these higher profile offenses, shootings, homicides, who have pretty extensive rap sheets, who are out on parole, out on bail, awaiting disposition of a pending case. Yet we do seem to have a little bit of disagreement between the department and some of the city's prosecutors in terms of how to approach incapacitating some of these kind of repeat customers, where we're seeing a lot more pretrial diversions of gun offenders, for example. We're seeing lower sentences being sought. We're seeing just yesterday, actually, in the New York Daily News, Cy Vance published an op-ed arguing that we should not bring back broken windows and that we shouldn't ask prosecutors to pursue lower level offenses, even if that person is repeatedly blowing their second chances. And so, a couple questions that come to mind here is how can the police department be maximally effective without the kind of support that you're talking about from the other parts of the criminal justice system? In other words, do some of these decarceration efforts that are sort of efforts aimed at decarceration for its own sake, do they risk eroding some of the benefits of good policing? And is there something the department can do about that? Or do we really need more collaboration along the lines of what we saw during the Great Crime Decline?
Yeah, that's right. That's a great observation, everything that you just said. I will say that I'll start from this point. When you look at the 5 prosecutors in New York City, and then we have a special narcotics part, and we have an Eastern and a Southern district. But I'll stick to the 5 local prosecutors. And even I'll expand it beyond to, whether it's defense attorneys or advocate groups. I think we all want the same thing for the most part. We want to see safety. We want to see programs that work. Certainly, there are differences of opinion at times, but I think that overall there is a very good working relationship on multiple levels, really down to where the work actually takes place too, at a lower level than me, between the police department and different units in the, for example, Brooklyn or Manhattan DA's office, or the Bronx, Queens, Staten Island. Are there differences of opinion? Yes. Do we all want the exact same thing and work together very effectively nearly every single day? Yeah, that's the case too. But I think you hit on something where, when you talk about the entire system, I did an end-of-year review of crime statistics a couple years ago, and I'm probably going back about 4 years. And I talked about what a successful year we had that particular year. And I made the statement that it was in Brooklyn. I said, I believe that the next future, like seismic gains in crime reduction in New York City, if everything else stays equal, is when we really get it right, looking at the entire criminal justice system. And I think that the mistake a lot of people make is talking about crime or statistics, and they say, NYPD, what do you think? The NYPD is a driving force and will take the lead, but we're one component. So you really have to look at what happens then from the arrest, the decisions on how to prosecute the arrest. You mentioned pretrial diversion. When is it appropriate? When is it not? How do those decisions really affect crime? Which programs work and which don't? Because it's logical to think that some programs work better than others. And then going beyond that to when we make decisions about probation, how do we monitor individuals? How do we make sure that people that are responsible for the most crime are held accountable? Accountability doesn't have to mean behind bars, but maybe it's an effective program in probation where they really can change behavior. Accountability is key here, but between probation, parole, and all the different pieces of the system, how they work together. I'll tell you that there is a lot of collaboration. I mean, in the CompStat meetings that take place today, if Jack Maple was alive and sitting here today, you know, he would be probably pretty impressed on how we've shifted over the years. And we spend a great deal of time in those meetings now talking about individual people that are committing significant amounts of crime, and how the different pieces of the system work and can work together to fix what affects New Yorkers. And so that type of work does go on. It's something that is, you know, a work in progress, I would say. And I think that, you know, we all want to know what system works the best.
Right.
Whether we're diverting someone to, you know, drug treatment or an anti-violence program or any of the others.
So one of the, you mentioned that there's a lot of collaboration, that there's a lot of agreement, but there are also some differences of opinion. And, you know, again, as an outside observer, it would seem to me that one of the sort of core differences of opinion surrounds the issue of public order and its importance to the overall crime fighting mission of an organization like the NYPD, right? A lot of energy gets devoted to crime statistics like shootings and homicides. A lot of attention gets paid to things like riots. But one of the lessons of New York's crime decline that I took away from you know, one of the Manhattan Institute's most noted scholars, George Kelling, and he worked on this issue a lot with people like James Q. Wilson, and put his ideas into practice through Bill Bratton, was that public order matters. If people see disorder in their street, they're going to internalize that psychologically. That's going to affect how they engage with the community, whether they engage with the community. And when we see sort of disorder prevail, we see streets get surrendered, you know, to criminal elements over time. And so, you know, what I want to get from you is how important is, you know, public order maintenance going to be to the future of policing in New York City, and how do you sort of prioritize that and recognize its importance as an issue, while again we have, you know, the sort of dedication to not pursuing these charges when they are leveled?
Yeah, I think it is very important. I think it remains. Certainly, New York City is in a different place now than 20 or 30 years ago. This brings up conversations about broken windows, and people have very strong beliefs on that on multiple sides, right? And some people take a couple leaps, if you will, right, to incarceration. But to me, broken windows is really about something that you alluded to. It's about order. It's about paying attention to the small things. I think that one of the things that we've done over the last 6 years is give our officers options and make them more aware than ever that, when I ran CompStat, one of the things I used to say frequently was, when somebody calls up and complains about something, that doesn't mean you have to write a summons. It doesn't mean you have to arrest someone. But the one thing it really does mean is that you have to address the condition. Like, we have to be responsive to people that live and work in New York City. And that's to me, neighborhood policing at its core. Being responsive, developing that relationship with the people that we work for, and making sure that when there are issues, we address them through a wide range. It could be having a conversation with people and issuing a verbal warning. It could be issuing these days it's a non-criminal civil summons, because that in many ways has been taken away from us legislatively. But it's something that is not going away, I don't think. It's something that, at times we can improve on, to be quite frankly, where we've moved away sometimes. And the balance is, Rafael, that while we have to pay attention, obviously, to the more serious crimes first and foremost, at times there's a relationship between these minor, low-level order maintenance crimes. And we also recognize that we don't want the low-level crimes unchecked to become then the more serious, significant crimes and lead to shootings. And sometimes we see that as well.
You touched on something really important that I think I want to sort of transition into, which was that, the NYPD has a responsibility to respond to the concerns of communities. And I think, you are probably hearing things in two different voices, right? It's no secret that one of the challenges that the department faces as an institution today is the enormous amount of public anger that has kind of come to the surface, particularly in the wake of George Floyd's death under the knee of former Minneapolis police officer Dermot Shea. But even before that, right, it seemed like there was a heightened sense of anti-police sentiment kind of fomenting in the city, right? We saw, for example, the anti-fare evasion enforcement protests calling for the removal of police from the subways. You've spoken very forcefully about the killing of George Floyd. You've expressed empathy for the message that Black Lives Matter, which is something that I think should be axiomatic to absolutely everyone. That said, though, at both the state and city level, you mentioned we've had a host of reforms just adopted even recently in the wake of George Floyd's death. More than 10 laws signed by Governor Cuomo. We've had the city council pass the diaphragm bill, but we've also had some voices from the community calling for things like defunding the police. We have not seen the kind of organized demands for more policing in the wake of the increase in violence, which is something that I think runs counter to what a lot of us expected. So, what I want to start by asking you is, what are you and others in the department hearing from New Yorkers on the ground that you are encountering on a day-to-day basis? Is there a gap between the kind of defund rhetoric and what these troubled communities that we see in the crime data actually want from their police?
Yeah, absolutely. The answer is yes. I think that there is at times a disconnect, between what the communities want and what you read about. And that's not to say that there's not, many of the things that you brought up. I think there's some longstanding issues with distrust of the police, with wanting better service from the police. Wanting to be treated equally and fairly. I mean, and those are things that we are in 100% agreement with, and strive to get better at. And I don't think it's choose one or the other. I think that when you see something like that, what happened in Minneapolis, I think everyone would agree and should agree that it was, heinous to watch somebody die like that didn't have to die. But that doesn't mean you can't support the police too. I think you should call out what you see, and you can support the police. And I think it's just such a unique year that we went through. I think there is a lot of raw emotion, justifiably. But I think we're in a different place than we were a couple months ago, too, even just a few short months ago. Where we are right now, this is what I hear on the street every day, and I believe it. When you hear defund the police, I do not believe that that's what people want on the street. And I'm specifically talking now about people of color. They rely on the police department. They will call us out when we were wrong 100%, and I think that's a good thing because they hold our feet to the fire and make us better. But we have great relationships that we've been nurturing and building for years. And I think it was just such a unique point in time. I also think a piece of it, if I was going to be honest, which I am, is that people were scared to come out and say that they support the police, because as soon as they did, they would have protests outside their house and be shouted down. And I don't think that's healthy for anyone. I think we're better than that. I think we live in a country where we should value everyone's opinion, and we should have healthy debates, and we should sit across from adversaries and have those debates civilly and look for common ground as opposed to screaming. And maybe I'm guilty of that sometimes myself. But overwhelmingly, what I see is people supporting the police, asking for more police, upset about what they're hearing and seeing in the media, and telling me, quite frankly, that that's not how they feel. And I think that that's something that we're working through right now. I think that ultimately, cooler heads will prevail and will come back. That pendulum in law enforcement swings from one side to the other. We need it a little more firmly in that middle area where we hear each other. We're not too tough on crime, if you will, but we're not soft either. We're fair. We're working together, and we're hearing and seeing each other.
You mentioned it specifically from communities of color that you're hearing the opposite of what I think people might think if they just read the newspapers or watched cable news. And there's actually some data behind this. A recent Gallup poll showed that a majority of Black Americans across the United States do not support defunding their local police departments. But still, there is this kind of dominant narrative in the media that, the police pose an existential threat to communities of color. And as the son of a former NYPD detective, as someone who has many friends and family members within the department and within police departments around the country, I know for a fact that these are people who take these jobs specifically to help communities, often that they come from, because they have a streak of public service that runs through their hearts and in their families. And despite all that, we see this rhetoric continuing to kind of bubble up. And my question is how does that affect the morale of the rank and file? And does that pose a unique challenge to you as a leader of a department to not just, have the task of keeping crime under control, but of also corralling, a department and keeping them from, maybe falling into or falling victim to a sense of fear that they don't have the support, to get out of their cars and be as proactive as they should?
Yeah, no, great question. Before I answer it, I just got to say, I agree with you and what you said, and coming out of my last answer, but I think we have to be honest too. And there are times where we got to be quicker, and we got to be more transparent on dealing with discipline and rooting out, you hear this term, the bad apples, and I almost 30 years in law enforcement. I've worked with the best people that you would ever work with, and I see firsthand what they do every day. And they don't ask, who's calling when that 9/11 call comes. they're running towards the danger and trying to help people. But with that said, it's a tough job, and not everyone, through their own actions, have exhibited and proven to us that they deserve the right to wear that shield. And when that's the case, we got to make hard decisions and get rid of people that are tainting it for the overwhelming majority of officers. So that to be fair, that has to be said too. I think we can do better. I think that the public across the country probably doesn't understand how many officers get fired. And it's a small number, but it's significant. And if the public understood that, if we did a better job of getting that information out, I think it would change the narrative a little bit. To your question, it's an incredibly difficult time. I think about the men and women that put on the uniform every day. There are always ups and downs in this business, and it is cyclical to an extent. But I've never seen anything like I've seen this year. And if you think of just the craziness of it, 3-4 months ago, we were talking about having ticker tape parades for first responders. Nobody's talking about ticker tape parades anymore, right? And how quickly it turned. We lost 46 members of this department, uniform and civilian, to COVID. And they've come to work every day in extremely difficult circumstances. Now we're looking back and we know a lot more about this disease. And thankfully, the rates of people getting sick is down. And more importantly, the people getting treatment, I think, where the doctors have gotten a lot better in terms of knowledge on how to treat it. But there was a period there, and I know you know this, Rafael, like back in March and April, when you were literally scared to come to work. Well, members of the NYPD were coming to work every day and answering the call. And out of that period, when many are still working from home in the public and private sector, to have that incident happen across the country and just in the almost a perfect storm, what it came out of it. And those protests were extremely difficult for the men and women of this department, physically, mentally, verbally. I think they really handled themselves. Were there some mistakes? There's always mistakes, but overwhelmingly with incredible proficiency, with professionalism. And, now we're kind of inching towards hopefully really better times. It's a tough time. I worry about the officers. I worry about all 8.5 million New Yorkers, to be honest. And I do know, though, that it's how we're going to get out of this is together. Every time that we speak and talk to each other, whether it's talking about problems that we have or just saying to each other, thank you for what you do, I think is a positive. And I'll take the opportunity, anyone listening now, mail, calls, emails, and everything else, offering thanks for the officers. Thank you on behalf of the entire NYPD, because it does mean a lot.
I really, really appreciate those remarks. So, we're coming into the last, 15 minutes or so that we've got here. So I want to start getting to some audience questions. And one of them that's just coming over the transom is there a role, do you think, that the current sentiment might play in risking the future of the NYPD stock, which is to say, do you foresee not just the NYPD, but police departments across the country really having a long-term problem with recruitment and retainment as the job, sort of becomes more challenging in a variety of ways, right? We've got this new diaphragm bill that creates a new legal risk for police officers. We've got pushes to, increase the sort of legal exposure on the civil side for police officers, and we've got this anti-police sentiment that we've already spoken about. Are you seeing this sort of affect the structure of the department at the NYPD in terms of early retirements or missing out on recruiting high level talent?
Yeah. Across the country, pre all of this, many police departments have trouble recruiting. I attend conferences. I speak to friends across the country. That is a real problem. Depending, I think it's regional, depending on where you are, for a lot of different reasons. We traditionally have not had that problem in New York City. First and foremost, because of the population here, 8.5 million people. We're allowed to live in 6 surrounding counties. So now that boosts the pool here is so great. And we also draw from international. There is a brand, NYPD. So traditionally, we have not had problems recruiting. Will that change? Substantially, I think the jury is still out. I tend to think, if I was going to guess, no, we will not have significant problems in reaching benchmarks. But there is absolutely people, I know this definitively from personal experience, people that were pursuing a career in law enforcement that are now rethinking it. So that is a real problem. I think it's going to be hopefully less of a problem here in New York City, but I think it remains to be seen. And I think the way that it's all of the reasons that you said. It's a risk reward of what are the benefits. I mean, it's a great job still. It's the most rewarding job in the world. And I tell this to the rookies when they come on. You can literally change people's lives. You have a front row seat to the best, but also the worst. And that's a reality too. But the far greatly is outweighed by the good. But no one should, but no one should, no one should be worried about getting arrested for doing their job either. And that's a real problem. So it is a real concern. I think how it gets beaten back is that the people of this great city and great country will speak up and be a little more vocal. Right now, there is one narrative being said, but I think there's a silent majority that sees what's going on and says, you know what, while we want reform, while we want to hold our police officers to high standards, we also want to have public safety and make sure we're balanced in that. So I think that the tide will change a little bit, and I think it'll come not from the police and law enforcement. I think it'll come from the general public.
So we've got another question here from one of our audience members, and since we've only got 9 minutes left, I'm going to ask that we keep our responses to the next couple, to 60 seconds, so that we can try and get to as many as we can. So, this one actually goes to the supervised release issue. The question is, what exactly gets done once somebody is released? What does that supervision look like, and how does that differ, if at all, from what was sort of promised by the reformers?
Yeah, my opinion, and it'll get me in trouble, but I've said it publicly before. There is many different forms of supervised release. I don't want to throw an entire blanket over the whole thing and say, but in my experience, the term is thrown out there, supervised release, and when you dig down and peel back the onion, there is in fact no supervision. Are there exceptions to that? I'm sure there are. But I think that is a significant problem and needs to be further examined.
This is a lead into another question from the audience. The Manhattan Institute just recently lost a dear colleague and friend, DJ Jaffe, who did a lot of work on mental illness policy here in New York City. I just want to quickly send our condolences to his family if they're watching. But this question comes in from one of our audience members and asks how the NYPD sees the role of mandatory inpatient psychiatric care to solving the kind of homelessness issue that's associated with mental illness. We've seen some really horrific murders on the subway where people have been pushed in front of trains or attacked on the street by people who are just not well. There was that case down in Chinatown with an individual who had a long history of mental illness. But is that something that the NYPD is actively thinking about, and what should the public know about what your thoughts are there?
Yeah, that's one of those long-standing, very few solution problems. And are we actively engaged in that? Not really. We do a lot of work. We're very much in the camp of in support of diverting people out of the criminal justice system that have mental illness. But it gets beyond, I don't think that this is a law enforcement NYPD function. I mean, there are programs and practices in place where police at times arrest people that commit an offense. And now there is a practice where that can be raised as by the defense attorney, the prosecutor, and the judge. And is somebody fit to stand trial? That's number one. How often that happens, I don't have data on that. But my guess would be that people are just pushed through the system and now out and diverted. And there is an unwillingness, I think we know, to commit people. At times, it's something that we have to grapple with as society. I think we see it. We see it every day on the streets in New York City. And, you mentioned some of the more horrific cases where the Chinatown incident or pushing people in front of trains. But listen, people are paroled out of prison with mental illness as well. And what is that follow-up? And if we don't want to do inpatient where people are committed, we've moved away from that as a society decades ago. Whatever we have in place has to be effective. And you just feel for the people because there are clearly people out there that are unstable and need help. Right.
While we're on the mental health issue, there's another question here from the audience. You mentioned earlier, that the NYPD's kind of been hearing a lot of negative from the public, and that can sort of take its toll, we know, on the sort of psyche of an individual who's going to work every day and having crowds gather when they try to make an arrest, and watching the news and seeing their profession be maligned, and hearing from people that they care about in the communities that they serve that they're not wanted to some degree. Last year, the NYPD saw a really just tragic uptick in the number of suicides, that officers, were sort of taking their own lives in much higher numbers than we've seen in a long time. And so the question from our audience is, what level of mental health counseling is offered to members of the NYPD? Has something been done in the wake of that uptick, to make those resources more visible and more available? And is there an issue with a sense that this sort of makes you weak, as a cop? I think we all see, members of the NYPD as these tough, rugged individuals, but clearly, as you mentioned, you will get a front row seat to some of the worst things that you can imagine. And, what's your sort of thought as a leader of the department on the role that mental health is going to play in the future of policing in New York?
Yeah, one of the things I worry about is the cumulative effect. And I don't think there's enough study on this, the cumulative effect of seeing something bad. And maybe it's not the worst thing you've ever seen, but those small incidents over years. And what does that do in terms of and I'm not a clinician or a doctor, but what is the effect of that on a person's psyche? It is something that is critical to us. We have a lot of programs in place already. Both formal and informal, working in collaboration with the unions, trying to reduce stigma of people coming forward and saying, I need help. With all of that said, we still have an issue. I mean, you raised last year was out of the ordinary year for us here in terms of people taking their own lives. It really brought it to the forefront again, despite all that we already do. We recognize we have to do more. Coming out of that last year, we hired a psychologist separate and distinct from the existing that we have on board. There was a plan to hire even more. It's taken a hit with the defund because our budget this year is not probably going to allow that to happen. We did get a lot of people coming forward and donating time. There's too many to thank, but from the Police Foundation, from Columbia Presbyterian, private psychologists, etc. So many people that are willing to and have helped. Members of the police department that volunteer on their own time to be peer counselors, to look out for each other. So there's a lot that we're doing and more that we would like to do.
You know, that takes me actually into what I think will be the last question that we have time for from the audience, which is that you've mentioned the role that this, you know, defunding has played in kind of your plans on mental health initiatives for the department, and that's something that I think is should be really sobering for people who have advocated, you know, reducing the budget of the department. But this question is on that along those lines, which is that which areas of the NYPD do you think are going to end up being most affected by the recent $1 billion budget cut for 2021?
Yeah, and just for clarity's sake, I mean, the hiring of psychologists is more tied to just the general state of New York City right now, where obviously significant budget cuts
Sure.
in terms of the COVID and everything that New York City. So that's really tied to that one. With the defund movement, you know, the Lord, you know, we're in the middle of a crime wave right now, which we will get under control. I can tell you that the men and women are out there, detectives, uniform, that they're taking guns off the street, they're closing shootings. But the shame of this was how predictable it was. We came out publicly and said, this is not what we want to do right now. It's going to hurt communities of color. We knew that we had, when you tie COVID into this, we canceled an academy class in April because of COVID. It wasn't safe. We didn't, with what we knew at the time, we didn't want to risk recruits going into an academy. We had one class that was already in. We took steps to mitigate, but we didn't want to bring a brand new class in because now that many more people into the academy. So when you fast forward, that July class that was canceled was actually two classes. It was the April class that was canceled for COVID, and it was the scheduled July. That's 1,200 less cops right there. We had a 60% cut in overtime. That is beyond significant, because what we normally do in the summer months, we put thousands of extra cops on overtime on the street every day in areas where we have predominant shootings. They are not there this year. That's thousands of less. So then the other piece of this is the attrition. When you cut the overtime, we know that it speeds up the retirement process for people that are looking at pension calculations and things of that nature. So all of this has really, again, a perfect storm within a perfect storm. We're taking action to mitigate this, shifting resources throughout the department. Every cut has an effect somewhere, but we're doing what we have to do to make sure that the optimal number of police officers and detectives are on the front lines fighting crime. We'll worry about some of the other issues down the road. We're balancing out to make sure that the duty schedules. This weekend, there was a story about some officers being moved off of weekends. That's correct. I mean, most officers don't have weekends off, but for ones that were on, we moved 2/3 off just to give us more flexibility in staffing. So there is a lot of steps being taken to mitigate some of these defund things, but hundreds of millions of dollars is hundreds of millions of dollars. And right. The shame of it is that it's adversely affecting really the people that we're trying to help the most.
Well, that is all the time that we have. Before we close, I just want to invite all of you watching to take a look at the Manhattan Institute's research, subscribe to our newsletters. If you're able, please also consider supporting the Institute at the link you see below. MI is a nonprofit organization, and our work depends on support from people like you. Commissioner Shea, thank you so much for being so generous with your time. Thank you so much for all that you do. And please pass along my personal thanks to all of the officers in your command for the great work that they do. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rafael. Have a great day.
You too.